Good morning. Welcome to the board meeting of the Board of Vocational Nursing and Psychiatric Technicians. This meeting is being held on Wednesday, December 14th, 2016 at 1625 North Market Boulevard, Hearing Room South 102 in the city of Sacramento, California. I would like to call the meeting to order. I thank everyone who has joined us today in the audience. We will not be announcing this, who has signed in on the roll call sheet, just for the consideration of time, but I thank you all for being here today. Now I'd like to have the roll call of board members and establishment of quorum. I'm Samantha James Perez, board president. Will the board members please introduce themselves, starting at my far right?
John Deerking, public member.
Bernice Baste Martinez, public member.
Good morning, Andrew Murno, public member and board vice president.
John Vertito, LVN, nursing educator.
Tammy Indozo, LVN member.
We also have our executive officer, Dr. Kamika Brown, here with us. Dr. Brown, would you like to introduce yourself and your staff members?
Thank you so much. I'm Kamika Brown, executive officer. I have with me Jennifer Almanza, our support services manager, Cheryl Anderson, our assistant executive officer, Jessica Diaz, our nurse education consultant, and Jen Johnson, who is our evaluations manager.
Thank you. We also have legal counsel from the Department of Consumer Affairs, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Rebecca Bond, board counsel.
Great. That takes us to item number 3, and we've already introduced our board members. Again, thank you for being here with us today. We welcome public comment on any issue that we have on the agenda. If I forget to call for public comment, do not think I am trying to not receive it. Please raise your hand or motion, and we'll be happy to receive public comment from anything that is agendized on the agenda today. If time starts running low, I may have to limit the time. Usually it's about 3 minutes, but you will be notified of that. So I thank you for your cooperation, and we want to hear from everyone today. We value full public comment. At this time, I'd like to call for the Pledge of Allegiance, and if my fellow board member, John Vertito, who is a veteran, would like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Also, those of you that have been with us for the past few board meetings know this, but I'll repeat it for those of you who may be new. Will not be taking corporate breaks. If board members or audience members need a break, you can take one at your convenience. Please just try to exit the room as quietly as possible so as not to disrupt the business that's going on. Okay, that takes us then to agenda item number 4. And we're going to take 4 A, B, C, D, and E all together. Discussion, consideration, and possible action on the 2016-17 Sunset Oversight Review Report, Dr. Kamika Brown. And Dr. Brown, we have received your report and reviewed it in full. Are there any highlights you would like to bring to our attention?
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to, for the board's attention, if you could take a look at 4E, which is just the additional questions. So when we last spoke about this, you guys had provided us with the instructions that if there were non-substantive edits, that we were approved to go ahead and make those changes and to send back. And so what I'm highlighting for you at this time is that during the Thanksgiving holiday, we actually received these particular questions. And so that's what I have highlighted for you. And so I wanted to, what the staff then did upon return from the holiday is we took a look at these questions, we divided them accordingly, and then we integrated them into the original Sunset so as to maintain the readability of the document. And so I wanted you guys to be aware that that is what we have here for you. And so those are the new questions that are now integrated into this document. The other piece that I wanted to highlight is that the marching orders you guys provided to us for us to consider, there were a couple recommendations, and then there was an offline conversation with one board member where was the following, was to consider adding a list of accomplishments, to have a response in regards to enforcement monitor report, the executive officer letter, and then as regards to the education and work experience. I want to go through these line by line and tell you what the status of those. It's the first is regard to the executive officer letter. If you'll see that that is not in the document, that was intentional. And the reason for that is that well, we took that recommendation from one board member, we talked offline, but then we also considered the reason that we are in a biennial review is because there were some issues related to staffing and morale. And what we really wanted this sunset report to be was a highlight of the staff and was a review of how the staff is. And so what we did in its place is we did a recognition of the staff. And so you'll see that in its place is an acknowledgement of the staff, and that was intentional. And so instead of highlighting or having it at the forefront the EO, we really wanted it to be about the staff, and that was important. And so we have decided that instead of having an executive officer letter, let's have an attaboy to the staff. And so that's that page. In terms of the list of accomplishment, because that's woven throughout the document, we believe that we've accomplished that. We have a major list of accomplishments. Something that you will actually see that'll happen tomorrow once this document is finalized is that the staff is working on editing right now is one big thing that came out was in terms of how the mismanagement of resources. And one in particular was a complaint that you guys had heard about was mismanagement of potential of resources, including computers. We're happy to report that we are much more conscious of how we use resources, including our fiscal resources. And most recently, we have been much more conscious of how we use all of our resources, including computers. Just yesterday, we were able to donate computers to a local nonprofit. And so that picture and that response will actually be included. So that's a new update. And I think it's just a testament, again, to how we, under new leadership, are being much more conscious and thoughtful, and also giving to the community. So that's one edit that unfortunately is not here for today. And then the last thing, so you see the update for the enforcement monitor. And then now let's just talk about one thing that's been removed. So when we came to you last time, we talked about potentially repealing Method 3. After a consultation with stakeholders, including CNA, the public, we reviewed some Little Hoover recommendations. We do not want it to be a barrier to getting into the workplace. And so we understand that it's actually more important for us to take a closer look at Method 3 and see how we can shore that up versus removing that, because we understand the importance that the LVN and PT is one of the critical entries into the workplace. And so what we have is actually not a repeal of that method, but actually looking at changing some of the, as moving forward with considering changing regulation. And so you'll see that that is the change. And so with that, those are the things that you have here. Because this report is due tomorrow, the board is asking that, the staff is asking that any changes that you have, both substantive or non-substantive, that the recommendation is that you allow that, you delegate that to the EO and staff to move forward with, because this unfortunately is due tomorrow, and that is the only extension that we have been given by the legislature. We did ask for a longer extension, and that is what we were provided. So thank you so much.
I did have one question about the Method 3. As you stated, at the last board meeting, we actually voted to repeal it. And now we've had some input from other stakeholders, and they're reconsidering that. Though one thing I would just like to say on the record is, if Method 3 stays, my strong opinion is that it will need to be altered or redesigned in some way. It cannot stay the way it is now. There was large amount of fraud going on with that, and that doesn't protect our California consumers to have people who are not qualified providing care. And we did discuss that also in the practice committee. So I would just like to say on the record that if method 3 stays, then it should definitely be have some regulation changes. Okay. Do board members have any questions for Dr. Brown about the Sunset Review report? Dr. Bassney Martinez?
Thank you. You've given us some background on some of the more recent changes. Can you be more specific about the source of the new questions?
That's a great question. So the original set of questions that we came to you in October or November were from the Senate. We now have the second set of questions that came from the Assembly. So I appreciate that that could be slightly confusing. So the first set of questions when we first approached you came from the Senate consultant, and the second set of questions came from the Assembly, if that helps.
And what's the impact on Sunset given the change or the additional questions from that source?
So this is where it's a slightly confusing, and so I'll give you guys a little bit of a process question. So the boards are typically divided, and so that certain boards are reviewed by the Senate BNP, and certain boards are reviewed by the Assembly BNP. Originally, our sunset was going to be reviewed by the Assembly BNP. It appears now that we will have two sunset reports, one from the Senate and one from the Assembly. So we will have two responses.
I mean, with the experience I've had with the last sunset, it seems unusual. What if, is there collaboration between the reports, or we may get two different, I mean, they may contradict.
It is possible that we could have two different reports. That is correct. That could go into law. My understanding is that they do have they are collaborative, but they are collaborating bodies. But having this being my first time, Madam President, I guess that they could be two different. For example, one could say, only to have the fee schedule go up by $8, and one could say, no, don't implement the fee schedule at all. Yes, Madam President, that could happen. But so far, they are very collaborative.
Mr. Vertito?
Thank you. Going off your earlier comment, Madam President, another additional recommendation, Dr. Brown, is one of the things in the educational field that we're seeing in regards to the Method 3 process is that not all of the applicants are actually verifying skills. Too many times I've heard where, hey, you're my friend, you're an RN, could you just kind of sign this off and allow me to do it? Most facilities are reluctant to have non-licensed nurses perform skills because they're an employee. They are not covered under the Nurse Practice Act as being a formal student within an accredited vocational nursing program. So therefore, they're hesitant to allow CNAs or other healthcare professionals that are not licensed nurses perform the skills that are listed in the Nurse Practice Act. One of the things I would ask you to do is consider the possibility, if we can get the legislation through the process, is include a non-biased third-party validation of skills. For example, we could send the students or the candidates for the Method 3 to one of our accredited schools that we have throughout the state for a skills validation and testing, so that they can they can validate the skills needed that are expected to be possessed by a vocational nurse, that they can execute them correctly as to standard, whether it's a sterile procedure or a clean procedure, that they do so to standard to ensure the safety and the health and welfare of the patients under their care that are the residents, which is this board's responsibility. So I would ask that the consideration be given for a third-party skills validation.
And just to be clear, it's my understanding of method 3, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the verification of skills is done by a previous employer person, in one example.
Well, yes, as according to the Nurse Practice Act, any licensed a director of nurses or a supervisor, whether it's RN or LVN, can sign it off. The problem being is that are they actually executing to standard, or you're my friend and a wink and a nod and you pass?
When we've had problems with those verifications not being accurate, that's what led us down this road of examining method 3. So what you're suggesting is that there would be a more objective third party that the applicants would be sent to verify their actual skills.
Correct. If they're sent to an accredited educational organization that is accredited by this board and evaluated by instructors that are certified by this board, we can ensure that the standards for all LVN candidates, we already know that they're meeting the standards either through the military or an accredited school, but method 3, there is no validation that the nurse signing off the skills are in fact accredited instructors. They are licensed nurses, but they have neither the background or the experience to teach and to hold standards. So one of the recommendations I would ask that we consider is having an unbiased third party that's already accredited by this board perform the skills check.
And that makes sense to me just on my initial hearing of it. Dr. Brown, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
No, Madam President, that would be something I definitely think we included language in our updated evaluation proposal, and that would be fleshed out in the legislation and regulatory process. But yes, we did include language in that.
Thank you.
sounds reasonable if no other board members have an opinion. Dr. Basti Martinez?
I'm still kind of stuck on the fact that we're responding to two different entities. And on reflection, and particularly like with the last question, each entity could read the response in different ways and pass or make recommendations that, as exemplified, can be opposite. So talk to us about what the potential ramifications might be if there are conflicting legislative actions passed. I'm really concerned.
So your concern is valid. I can talk a little bit more about the things that the board is trying to do proactively because I am not able to wholly speak to that. There was a couple of our consultants usually come to these meetings, but today they are not. I don't see them in the audience. So starting in January, we are going to be having kind of lobby days. This is something that a lot of boards do, and that's where board members, particularly our legislative committee, will be meeting with stakeholders to talk about kind of our upcoming sunset, to talk about issues, to raise constituent issues, and then also just kind of a meet and greet to get to know. And so that is something that we are preparing for. Mr. Durkin has availed himself to be ready, so has Mr. Dabrowski. So we're already primed for that. Madam President has made herself available, and so has Mr. Vice President. And so we are doing those things. And our hope is that then when that conversation comes up about having potentially two reports, we can actually ferret out what are the implications of that and what can we expect. And then I'm hoping to be able to come back to you in February and talk about that at our February meeting, and to hopefully iron that out at that time as hearings near. But that is correct that is a two reports, multiple authors, raises a flag. And I think it's only fair for the board to see that as potential as an issue. I don't, because we did not have that, we have never had that in the history of this board, and I'm not sure that there are any other boards currently going up that have two reports to my knowledge today, but I could be misspeaking. And so I do think that that is something that's curious. But we are actively working to make sure that we are proactive about it and that we can provide concise responses so that we have that we're able to do all that we can to ensure that no matter the report that we have positive outcome as much as possible.
Yeah, I'm also a little bit bewildered. I think in the same vein as Dr. Basti Martinez, and have some obvious concerns. Do we have an actual date for our sunset hearing?
No, my understanding is that it should be around March, but I will do the best I can to get some information.
So we're meeting February 9th and 10th would be our next board meeting. So we'd have, if there was some concern, if there was some contradiction or inconsistency, we would have at least a month maybe.
Well, again, you guys would probably see more of that either in my monthly EO reports that you guys receive, or you would, the legislative committee would also meet and spearhead that activity.
Yes.
I just want to go on record, supposing if there are contradictory reports, I can only begin to imagine what that will mean for staff in terms of time and their work and their efforts in trying to be responsive to both, while at the same time carrying on with their regular duties and responsibilities. That really presents a serious work staffing issue. My perspective.
Any further questions from board members for Dr. Brown about agenda item number 4? Vice President Moreno?
Hearing the discussions today and the concerns from my fellow board members, and just in terms of the transparency and trying to better understand what may have occurred, do we have any indication or any sense of why the different reports came about, or how that may have transpired?
I can say I became aware of the second report around I want to say October.
Okay.
So prior to that, it was my understanding that we were always going to be submitting a report to the assembly.
That was my understanding too. That's the information I received.
And then it started to emerge around late September, October, that there were 2 reports. And then it was validated. Sorry, I'm looking at Jen because I know we went to the Capitol in November. And it was validated in November that we, in fact, were going to have 2 reports. So it emerged as a new... to my understanding, it emerged as a new development, and it sounds like, Madam President, that was a new understanding for you
Yes,
as well.
I had no idea that was current.
Okay.
Any other questions for Dr. Brown regarding agenda item number 4? Mr. Deerking?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Brown, my concern is that although we have a monitor assigned, it's essentially an audit. So my question is, has there been an established methodology that you know of that the board can review as far as the practices of the monitor?
So what the board was provided is, so on March 10th, the board was invited. So there was on March 10th there was a kickoff meeting, and the board was invited to part of that meeting. And then on March 11th, so there was an outline or a time frame of the different phases The monitors, it has been an iterative process in terms of how he was going to approach the project. And I do not believe that I have not been privy to the actual methodology or the approach. I don't know that it's so in comparison to say kind of how BSA would approach that, where they have a very kind of rigorous. They go in, they actually. Access the server, they take the questions, they know what they're kind of looking for, and they leave. It is that is under my understanding, it is not that way. It seems to be very iterative, and it kind of changes based on what's found. It also doesn't appear to be in comparison to kind of the internal audits where they have a list of they're looking for this type of file and they're going to do this and then they're going to report out. I don't know that it is that way. It seems to be a little bit more maybe evolving. So no, I have not seen that.
Well, that's a concern, if I might follow up, because of course we have an education function here, approving different institutions, licensing and enforcement, and the report appears to be very top heavy on enforcement. In fact, when we asked the monitor that question at the time of our last meeting, the top two priorities related to enforcement. So that's my concern.
That's a fair assessment.
And just as a follow-up, are we required to complete all of the monitor's recommendations?
So that I'm glad that you brought that up. So that's another question that I needed to bring to the board because that actually is another clarification. So on approximately November either 17th or 18th, Jen and I had a meeting that was with the Senate Assembly and the speakers, and we did get clarification related to that. And this was something that at our last meeting, the board may have been there. I need to clarify. And what was said to the board by the Senate consultant was that we had to comply with all of the recommendations. That is not 100% accurate. We do not have to comply with all of the recommendations. However, if we do not comply with all of the recommendations, we do have to support what we are doing. And the monitor will still, however, will report out on the status of his recommendations. And that information was stated by all of the consultants. So I want to just make sure that you are aware of that. And so that information was provided to us at that meeting.
So for instance, there were several recommendations of things that we've already been proactively doing. We've already been proactively been addressing. And those were some things that we've said, we've already done this. Here's the proof, and it will be followed up by one of our committees. So it's things like that, where we can say that we're already doing this.
Right, and the bill actually outlined does not require us, but we would just have to substantiate that we're doing that under another mechanism, and so we will have to do that. But he will continue to report out in his reports
Sure.
that he has outlined that we are doing this, that his recommendation was put forth, and we may not be complying with it under that method. Like, for example, just because I'm looking at Tammy, there were many recommendations that were related to things that were labor issues.
Right.
And so as long as we're able to substantiate due to the labor issues, we are not complying with those. But he will still respond that they did not put these things in place, right? But then we have to say, well, justify why, because we will have to then testify to that. And that was all three consultants that were present at that meeting did respond that those are the things that we will then just have to demonstrate why or why not.
And my belief, and from what I know of what we've done at the board and the accomplishments that have been made over the past year, that we would have no trouble at all substantiating what is very well documented, the progress that has been made, and the reasons already accomplished these things.
And so that's the reason why, and I hope that grid you guys are able to follow that grid. We put that in the new sunset so that you would understand. In no way are we trying to put the board at risk. We want to make sure that you're understanding that these are things that because we have some staffing. We want to make sure that you understand that we're doing this under a different mechanism, so we will never not have these things done. But it is a case that it would be duplicative for us to do this separate reporting, or it would be exhaustive. But we already have these things done, and so when it comes time to prepare this testimony, we will be able to do these things. We just are not able to do these things twice, right? But we will definitely be able to substantiate all of these things.
So if I just might follow up, our alternative is to demonstrate a path towards substantial compliance.
Yes.
Thank you.
Other board members have questions for Dr. Brown regarding agenda item 4. Hey, I don't see any. I do believe we do require a motion on this agenda item. Yes?
Sounds like the board would like to adopt what's presented today and delegate to their EO any non-substantive changes. That, I think, what Dr. Brown was alluding to.
Adopt all recommendations and delegate to non-substantive changes? Yes? Mr. Vertito?
I was going to make the motion, but our counsel beat me to the.
Well, I
To the
still need you to
point.
make a motion.
Going to. So moved.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor. It's been seconded. At this time, I'd like to take public comment on agenda item number 4. If there's any public comment, could you please come forward and have a seat at the desk in front of us? Going once, going twice? Okay. I don't see any public comment at this time. Any further discussion by the board? Okay. Motion, it's been seconded. No public comment, no further discussion by the board. I'll take a roll call vote, starting on my far left with Ms. Endozo.
Yes.
Mr. Vertito.
Yes.
Vice President Moreno.
Yes.
I'm also a yes. Dr. Baste Martinez.
Yes.
Mr. Deerking.
Yes.
Okay, so it's unanimous. That motion passes. Thank you. Agenda item number 5. And if my eyes do not deceive me, I see that we're going to be talking about cost recovery, which is something we've been wanting to put on the agenda for quite a while, and we've had some obstacles and some hiccups. So I'm very interested in the agenda item number 5, Enforcement Committee Report and Recommendations, Consideration and Possible Action on Recommendations Regarding Matters Related to Cost Recovery. And that's our Enforcement Committee, Vice President Moreno and Mr. John Deerking. We have received your report and we've read it in full. Would either of you like to discuss any highlights or bring anything out in your report specifically?
I know that this board has been wanting to discuss that, but I'm actually sensitive that some of the other board members who have also wanted to discuss this are not here. And I would think that, and just open it up to the board, if perhaps we should table this and then bring it back up in February. I would only say that, again, because other board members have made public comments on this topic who are not here, and I just think that they would want to have the opportunity to speak on this. But that's just my opinion, and so I
Well,
just put
it
that out there.
hurts my heart a little bit that we've been working on this for so long. I do know that Mr. De Brownstein is not here, who has has strong opinion about it, and I also believe Mr. Ma has had quite a bit of he requested a large amount of discussion on this. So we know that they could both not be with us today.
And I would also add Ms. Norton as well as
Oh,
made
yes.
comments.
Yes. So what is the board's pleasure? Is that a motion that you're making?
I'd open up to other discussions by the board. That's just my opinion, but I mean, I'm happy to discuss it if my other board members feel that's appropriate.
If the board chooses that there may, should the committee want to make some type of recommendation, it also may be noteworthy to then get deeper analysis and financial information so that we can have a much more robust discussion.
Sounds like a good idea. I mean, I know that there was some discussion here, but I agree that if the enforcement committee would be willing to take it on, we could get even some more deeper or more comprehensive information and discuss it in February. Although, as I said at the last board meeting, it must, no maybes, no ifs, ands, or buts. It must be on our February board meeting agenda. However that has to happen, it must be. Mr. Durkee?
Yes, I just want to report that we did meet in October. Subsequent to that, and after our November meeting, I had the pleasure and opportunity to visit the Attorney General's office
Great.
in San Diego. Met with Mr. Gregory Salute, who's a supervising DAG, one of the staff deputies, Aaron Sunseri, and one of the chief assistants, Linda Schneider. And it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of share some of the concerns that staff brought up relating to fast-track eligible cases. And I know we have been meeting with, at least periodically, Brett Kingsbury from the San Francisco office. And one of the questions that came up from staff is that if a case is not eligible for fast track, there's not a lot of follow-up from the Attorney General's office. Once a case has been determined not to be eligible for fast track, sometimes we don't hear anything back. Now, my understanding, based on the process, on the fast track cases that are referred, is that sometimes it relates to an understanding of what's fast track eligible in the first place. For example, it's anticipated that these would be non-adversarial cases. So once a licensee or applicant secures counsel, then it is going to be removed from the fast track because it's now adversarial, and then it's going to wind its way through the process. Another case situation involves the requirement for, these are supposed to be paperless, more or less. In other words, not a lot of evidence has to be obtained in order to secure moving forward with the final disposition on the case. Or sometimes it relates to a delay from the applicant or licensee himself or herself. So those are different reasons why a case could be delayed and could result in a lengthier time in order for it to have a final disposition. You might know that we adopted the CPEI standards in May of 15. In October 15, the board filled a new position, an intake analyst, and right now we do have a dedicated fast track coordinator, Amy Wyckoff, of the BVN PT staff. At the end of the day, we might require some more training on the issues as far as what is going to be eligible for fast track review. And it was also recommended that we make full use of the delegated subpoena power that we have. And there's a coordinator in San Francisco, Oakland office. And I don't recall, I'll have to look up who that is.
I agree with you about the fast track. I was when the enforcement committee previous iteration of the enforcement committee was an enforcement task force, and it was me and Vivian Avella. And I remember very clearly speaking with Linda Schneider and saying there's going to be this fast track program, and everyone was very excited about it. It seemed to have gotten off to a little bit of a slow start, but maybe is now gaining speed again. And I appreciate very much your diligence in going down to San Diego, Mr. Deerking, and following up with that.
No, thank you, Madam President. And not only is it successful, it's expanding now to the Bay Area, Oakland and San Francisco, and then I believe also Sacramento.
But I do think that your diligence in reaching out to them and having meetings with them keeps us on their radar, so to speak. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
As far as the cost recovery issue, are we saying we want to table it?
Well, I'll make a motion, then we'll just see how that goes. Motion to continue the item of crisis recovery to our February 2017 meeting.
Second.
May I just make one comment?
Of course.
Relative to the issue of cost recovery, maybe prior to the next meeting, would it be possible to meet with DCA Financial to conduct a longitudinal study on as far as the recovery? Because I don't know if we have any metrics on that.
I think that sounds to me like a totally appropriate thing for enforcement committee to do.
I would, yeah, I concur. I think that's a great idea, John.
You're willing to, take that on?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a motion on the floor. It has been seconded. Any public comment about tabling cost recovery discussion until our February 10th board meeting? I don't see any at this time. Is there further discussion by board members? Mr. Vertito?
My concern at this point is I think we're going to be in Los Angeles at the time, and a lot of the board members have to travel quite a bit, and this is usually on a Friday night. The last time we did this, we went well into the evening, and my concern is time management on this discussion. It is something that many of our absent colleagues have a very valid discussion point in, but we really need to watch the time management, because this is something that can very clearly monopolize the time of the board on that Friday.
Absolutely.
And we may have board members that want to participate, but for one reason or another may not be able to because it's later in the agenda. So if we do table it, this will be the second time it's been tabled, and I agree we could put more data into it. Excuse me. My concern is with more data, there's more discussion.
And I think that I'll also get Dr. Brown's opinion on this, but I believe that the agenda isn't fully set for February, so we could create the agenda in a way with respect to the large amount of time it's probably going to take for this discussion, which we know is going to be a colorful conversation.
The two things at the last meeting that you guys afforded the EO was, one, that we had the flexibility to add an additional day, and two, that we had the flexibility of tweaking the agenda. So we will be looking at both, but we will ensure that you have the time necessary for this. But we will make sure that the minutes from the enforcement committee regarding the financial give you enough information so that your information is targeted.
Thank you. It's just that with the importance that this, both the governor's office and the legislature have on this issue, we want to make sure we do it right and give it the time necessary. And I don't want to, as we discussed in November, I don't want to try to rush it through. And this is important to all the powers that be as well as our own. And I want to make sure that we have the appropriate amount of time to do a thorough job and do it justice.
You're right. It affects everyone. It even affects our constituents and our licensees, presumably, when they're in the disciplinary process. So I think it's a conversation long overdue, and I think that we do need to give it the time on the agenda that we will need for it. We don't want it to be obviously at the very end and people having to leave for flights, things like that. So if we could, and staff's here, if we could just allot a large chunk of time to this particular discussion, and I agree, it should be a very hearty.
Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President?
Yes.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing correctly. Let me paraphrase back. We are in support of the longitudinal report so we can have the data before us to use for our decision making. I just want to make sure I heard that correctly.
I believe that it would be a great idea if the enforcement committee are willing to work on that.
And hopefully we can have that prior to the meeting so we can analyze that, digest it, and come prepared with whatever questions we might have.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's a motion on the floor. It's been seconded. No public comment. We've had further board discussion. At the time, I'd like to take a roll call vote on the motion to table the discussion of cost recovery to the February 10th meeting. And I'll start on my far left with Ms. Mendoza.
Yes.
Mr. Bertito.
While I am honored and flattered, I do not measure up well to my colleague being a psych tech and me being a vocational nurse. But I do take his.
Thank you.
Anyway.
No insult.
Yes. The answer is yes.
Vice President Moreno.
Yes.
I'm also a yes. Dr. Baste Martinez.
Yes.
Mr. Deerking.
Yes.
Thank you. Great. Moving right along. Oh, that's me. Okay, so agenda item number 6 is the practice committee report on recommendations, consideration and possible action on recommendations regarding matters related to respiratory care, consideration and possible action on recommendations regarding procedures for care in clients with respiratory deficits, practice committee recommendations regarding impact of Business and Professions Code Division 2, Chapter 8.3, Article 6, on scope of practice of licensed vocational nurse and psychiatric technicians. This was a practice committee. We did meet, and let me find my paper here. We did meet. It was Donna and myself. Unfortunately, Donna was not able to be here today, and we did discuss both the Method 3 issue, which we've already discussed previously this morning. I won't go too far into that. But we did discuss quite frankly, a threat to our vocational nurse scope of practice. And I really do wish Donna had been here because she's our LVN member of the practice committee, but I'm also going to rely heavily on Mr. Vertito, who's our LVN educator member, to with your expertise of what is taught in LVN schools and the scope of practice of LVN.
Thank you, Madam President. If I may?
Yes.
Thank you. Under the California Nurse Practice Act for vocational nursing, LVNs are encouraged and mandated to be data gatherers. By the state scope of practice, LVNs are not independent practitioners. We function under the supervision and guidance of a registered physician, medical doctor, or a registered nurse. As part of the training for an LVN in the regards to the respiratory care, LVNs are taught everything from the basics on assessment and data gathering of the respiratory system, including anatomy, physiology, and then they have extensive training in regards to assessment of respiratory status. That includes auscultation of the respiratory system. That includes evaluation of oxygen circulating throughout the body, and to make determination if there is sufficient oxygen saturation throughout the body to maintain all the bodily functions, including level of consciousness, pain, discomfort, or anything that can inhibit the intake and the exhalation of oxygen and respirations, and certain methods that are allowed by the Nurse Practice Act to make those assessments and to report any abnormalities found. If they have standing orders, either by policy and procedure of the facility, standing orders of the physician, they may take action such as instituting opening the airway physically by repositioning of the patient, administering respiratory medications, and then evaluating the effectiveness of those medications and following through with instructions given by the doctor for secondary treatment or positioning as necessary. In regards to ventilation, additional training is required after, additional training is always recommended after licensure. While it is covered in the class, most facilities or schools do not always have ventilators on campus. However, there are numerous clinical sites that do use ventilations, and that the clinical instructor and the respiratory care staff, both RN and respiratory therapy, help educate the students not only on the various models of ventilators, but how they make the adjustments, how they take the doctor's order and show them how they're affected in the ventilator system, how the patients are cared for if the respiratory tract becomes occluded because of bodily fluids, suction, or administering of medication to either the patient that is and is not on a ventilator, and then to determine the effectiveness of those medications or treatments after the fact, and then the follow-up should complications or blockages still occur. The training on LVNs in regards to respiratory care is every time they're in the hospital, a respiratory assessment is considered a standard assessment whenever patient care is provided by the LVN student. It is an expectation of any LVN going on the floor that as part of their general data gathering or an assessment, a respiratory system assessment is included. Auscultation is taught on not only listening to the chest, but being able to identify the lung fields, the lobes of the lung, the assessment of the patient's inhalation and exhalation, the effectiveness of oxygen saturation levels throughout the body, and what are the physical things within the nursing scope of practice an LVN may accomplish without a doctor's order because it is a nursing intervention. And then being aware of the doctor's order that if the patient has a respiratory diagnosis, what medication, treatments, or procedures are allowed under the supervision of a doctor or an RN the LVN may institute. Now, the training on an LVN in the respiratory care, if they're working 40 hours in a clinical site, includes every part of that assessment. Students are taught that every time they walk into a patient's room, whether it be 5, 10, 15, or 20, they're taught to do a preliminary assessment. Oxygenation, signs and symptoms of oxygenation are included as part of a patient's assessment. Even though it may be in the room for 2 minutes, oxygenation can be clearly determined by simply looking at the patient and interacting with the patient to check for signs of anoxia or any type of respiratory distress by level of consciousness, the ability to carry a conversation, by looking at any type of labored respiration or respiratory distress. These are generally taught to the students to be identified immediately on entering a room. And this should be conducted each time there is an interaction with the patient. So suffice it to say there are over 40 hours, well over 40 hours, of not only classroom training, but clinical training throughout the education of an LVN. Respiration status is not only trained, but the students are taught how to document the patient's respiratory status and to be able to perform a focused assessment on the respiratory system should there be, 1, a respiratory diagnosis assigned to the patient, or 2, there is any signs or symptoms of respiratory distress that the doctor and the RN should be immediately notified for the presentation of these symptoms for immediate action, because it is considered one of the vital signs. It is one of the considered of the ABCs for respiratory care, or critical care, as in CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, maintaining the airway, and ensuring that the patient has sufficient breath to maintain life.
And one other thing I might add, I know with psychiatric technicians, there's extensive training on tracheostomy care and suctioning. Is that same with our parallel license of VN?
That is correct. We spend expensive laboratory time providing tracheostomy care, changing the trach ties and the dressing care that's needed, and to perform suction, both oral suction to maintain an oral airway, nasal suction to maintain a nasal airway, and trach suction to maintain airway through the trachea. Also, in addition, personally speaking, working as a home health nurse for over 5 years, I received extensive training in preparation to taking care of patients, both adult and pediatric, that were ventilator dependent. And I worked for 5 years on the night shift, where I was the sole medical care provider to a patient that was ventilator dependent. I was required to change the circuit to ensure that all the settings were in compliance with the doctor's order, and be able to identify problems or challenges the patient may have while using a ventilator, and should there be a failure, mechanical failure of the ventilator, to take appropriate action to maintain health welfare of my patient. Now, this is incumbent on additional training of more than 40 hours on the various models. I think there are at least 3 various home care model ventilators that were done. And of course, it is documented, and I actually received CEUs for that type of training. And it's something that if you're working as a ventilator in home care, that's something that behooves you to maintain current education and training on the various new ventilators that are coming out, procedures, new diagnoses that are coming out.
Right, both of our licenses, PT and VN, both have continuing education requirements. All professionals should continue to increase their knowledge. We also, I do want to point out, have another VN here on our board, Tammy Mendoza, so I'm sure you will have some valuable input as well.
As for me, when I went to school, we specifically got trained on a vent unit, working with the ventilator, vented patients. So I had over not only classroom, but I had clinical events.
When I first became aware of this issue, when I was vice president, before I was president, it was such even a question of whether respiratory care is included in a VN's scope of practice or studies was just so standard. It's almost like, can a VN give an intramuscular injection? Can a VN take a blood pressure? I mean, it was so standard to me. I was actually surprised that there would be any question about it at all. Nevertheless, apparently there has been. But one thing I would like to say to our board members that are public members that might not understand everything about scope of practice or professional standards of practice is, it is my strong opinion, and also my fellow practice committee member Donna Norton's strong opinion, that be in scope of practice, this board cannot, will not allow a centimeter, a micrometer of that to be eroded, either through misinformation or the spreading of falsehoods. And I think we need to take a very definitive stance, I would say, that this is within our scope of practice, and any information spread to the contrary needs to stop. I mean, just needs to stop. And this affects our schools. All those of you who are directors out here of schools, our California labor associations, nurses associations. The LVNs are skilled, well-trained, and capable of providing this important care to California consumers. Are there any questions from public members about this? Mr. Durkin.
I do, Madam President. I'm aware of a letter dated September 29, 2005. It was issued by a former executive officer of this board. And in it, to summarize, the board formally rescinds any and all scope of practice policy statements that were issued prior to January 1st, 2001. Now, my understanding is that is not scope of practice issues are to be relegated by legislative process and are not subject to change by either administrative process or executive process or even by board fiat. Is that correct? Scope of practice issues have to go through the legislative process?
That's accurate.
Also, I know that everyone received a letter from the Attorney General's office. I don't have the exact date on that, if someone wants to reference me on that, but there was a,
August 7th,
of what year?
2007.
2007, that board members can read and is also available to the public, stating that other healthcare professionals, well, I don't want to summarize it. Do you want to? Tammy, that there are other health professionals that can provide respiratory care, and in California has a large consumer base. There's many disciplines that provide care to our California consumers, and we all have roles, and sometimes our roles overlap. But it doesn't mean that we can't collaborate together. It gets concerning to me when there's things that I've seen apparently in here, such as cease and desist letters with information that appears to be inaccurate or that is detrimental to the VN scope of practice. And I think as this board, we have to stand strongly behind our licensees in maintaining their scope of practice. That's my opinion. That's my strong opinion. I know that Ms. Norton, who's my practice committee member, has voiced the same. Yes, Mr. Vertito.
As one of the longer serving members of this board, we made very clear over time that the only person who can the only governmental organization that can define the scope of practice of a vocational nurse or a psych tech is this board, specifically in the guise of our nursing education consultants, who are the subject matter expert of the scope of practice for vocational nurses and psych techs. And that you are absolutely right that there is going to be some overlap. That to say that an RN is not able to provide respiratory care, or that an LVN, where we do receive extensive training in respiratory care of our patients, and that only we are trained in medication administration of all respiratory med, whether it be aerosol, inhaler, is very narrow-minded in respects to an RN or an LVN being able to provide, or excuse me, a psych tech, being able to provide care to a patient with respiratory needs. And by long standing, and by definition of the Nurse Practice Act, only this board has the responsibility to define what an LVN or psych tech may or may not do under the scope of practice.
Well, and that's one reason we have expert witnesses. Before, most people know, before I was a board member, I was an expert witness for the board. And when there's a question, we go to hearing, and there's expert consultants that explain scope of practice. And yes, our scope of practice is dear to us, and it quite frankly is a little personal if there's what we perceive as misinformation out there. So I'm sure that we have public comment on this this issue. Do we need a motion first on this?
I just have one follow-up
Yeah,
question.
Mr.
Really,
Gibson.
it's in two parts. The cease and desist letter issued by another board. Let me just summarize. That would either impede or impair the vocational nurse's scope of practice. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And should the institutions who are the recipients, the intended recipients of the letter, abide by that, would that impede or impair healthcare delivery?
Yes, there would be a limitation. Our scope of practices would be misrepresented, and because some other, maybe home health, received an alarming letter, then it would be a unfair restriction on practice of VNs. And VNs, let me just reiterate, are skilled, trained, capable, and this is good for California consumers to have options of who can provide treatment to them. Sure, a respiratory therapist, of course they can provide respiratory care. And RNs, VNs and psych tech should not be excluded from that, because we are qualified, are trained, are skilled, and it's in the best interest of California consumers to have that option.
And my further concern is anytime we talk about inhibiting scope of practice, then there's a restriction of trade, which was addressed by the Supreme Court case, the North Carolina case.
And it's funny you say that, Mr. King, because that was what I was thinking about actually on the flight up here. Is we know that in the North Carolina versus Federal Trade Commission, Dental Board versus North Carolina Dental Board versus FTC, Federal Trade Commission, that the dentists were restricting restricting other people from performing a practice to their own benefit. And I was actually thinking about that. I haven't discussed that with anyone up here on the board, but I was actually thinking about that if there is possibly a board attempting to restrict our own practice, that may have some implications of the same. I haven't discussed it with legal, so I'm not totally going down that road yet, but I had the same thought that you had. I know you are a lawyer, so I'm sure you
Well,
have.
I would like to point out that we do have a public majority here on this board, which is one of few of the DCA boards that are public majority.
Yes, and which was not the case with the North Carolina decision. So we're actually ahead of the game, and in such a way that we do have a public majority, which is what came out part of that decision, if I'm saying it correctly. Dr. Baste Martinez?
And thank you, all of you, for being very specific about the practice and what's required, as well as sharing some of your own professional experiences. As a board with the responsibility for protecting the public, it would appear quite logical that we would want to ensure that the scope of practice is inclusive, broad, and sufficient to cover the potential work sites where any VN might find themselves, herself or himself, working. As a public member, I recognize I could be one of those patients.
Exactly. Any further comment? Ms. Mendoza? Yeah, I was just about to get to that, what our motion would in fact be, what our motion would include.
So let me try.
Okay, go ahead.
How about I make a motion to have the practice committee issue a statement to the respiratory board, respiratory care board, or something to that extent.
Yes, I'm going to also get the opinion of Dr. Brown, because I know there has been some communication in a meeting that I was not able to be at. So I'm not sure where we're at in the communication. Did you want to add anything to that? Or
Sure. So on Monday, we had a meeting between DCA executive and legal and a few other people that I'm not sure who all was in the room. And the meeting, the decision was that, and Respiratory Care Board and myself, Donna, Mr. Vitito, Cheryl Anderson, and the decision was that we were going to impanel a work group to come together and work collaboratively on kind of delineating where kind of our practice, our scope of practice, kind of where we kind of start and stop. And so it was kind of coming up with that. My suggestion was that the practice committee serve as our representatives for that. I am not sure who from the Respiratory Care Board would be serving, and then DCA offered that legal representation should be included in that particular work group, and so that's where we are in terms of that. I think the other piece of this, however, the other point is that there are still stakeholders that are looking for some guidance because they are continuing to receive. It sounds like they may be receiving cease and desist letters as well as fines, and so I'm not sure if that I don't, that does, because it doesn't come from us, I don't know if we have any impact on that. But I think the work group may help to flesh some of that out.
Well, and I noticed somewhere in the reports, I don't have it directly in front of me, and I know Ms. Anderson is here, maybe could shed some light. When we get inquiries, inquiries into the scope of practice of a VN as related to respiratory care, yes, we are correctly stating what the VN scope of practice is. Yes, Mr. Vertito?
In regards to Ms. Mendoza's proposal, since it's on the table, I would ask that when members of this commission, whether it's an employee or a board member, especially our practice, we make it very clear, whether it's in writing or verbally, that this board is the only organization that defines the scope of practice for its psych techs and the vocational nurses in the state of California on what they are and are not able to do. I want to make sure that it is mentioned unequivocally that if there's any questions, this board is open to answer any questions. But only this board is the only governmental agency in the state of California that can define the scope of practice for a psych tech or a vocational nurse in the state of California by our own charter in the Nurse Practice Act.
And one thing I would add to that, I'm sort of trying to catch Ms. Anderson out of the corner of my eye here, because I know that you are now our acting assistant executive officer, but you still have a little bit of a hat of the supervising nursing education consultant. I know that requests for clarification, scope of practice issues do come through the NECs, and what I believe that you're probably already doing, but would just add, is when those come in regarding respiratory care issues, that we very vigorously defend what is our scope of practice. We very unequivocally state in those letters what is the scope of practice of a VN with training and things like that. That it be just very clear. I'm sure that's already been done. Okay, so there's a motion for a practice committee to write a letter. Yes. There a second on the floor?
I'll second.
So now that we have a motion on the floor and it's been seconded, I'm very sure that we have public comment on this issue. So I would like to invite anyone who would have public comment to please come forward to the front table. And if we have more, we can always form a line. It's helpful if you would introduce yourself and the organization you represent. As always, if you wish, you can remain anonymous. The button for your microphone is right here on the bottom. It turns green. Welcome.
Madam President, Kobe Pizzati with California Association of Psychiatric Technicians. We would just like to align ourselves with your comments, Madam President, and yours as well, Mr. Vertito, that we believe that the scope of practice for the VNs should not be reduced or rescinded in any way, shape, or form, because we work side by side with our brothers and sisters that are VNs, and it only makes things safer to have people having overlapping duties. So with that, we would just simply like to say we support this motion.
And thank you, Mr. Pizzati, and any support that you could.
Please, if you need a support letter from us in any way, shape, or form, we could definitely do that.
Hello again. It's helpful if you.
My name is Stephanie Nunez. I'm the Executive Officer for the Respiratory Care Board. I just wanted to say that I hope that we can get this work group together, because I think it would be incredibly beneficial to really get down to the specific tasks that we're talking about. No one's really pinpointed those, I don't think. And we do have some that I think are probably the ones that we need to review. I also really appreciate your story of your history of work experience. Though I think that we also need to while your personal experiences sounds like you've had a lot of experience, education or experience training in respiratory care, I think that that is not the norm. And in addition to that, I think that we need to look at the legal scope of practice, because I think you have issues. I think really we need to bring in our legal counsels in order to determine the scope of practice, because I think if you want to expand your scope of practice, I think that's fine. Every profession does it, but I think you have to go about it the right way.
And let me just stop right there and say we are not seeking to expand our scope of practice. We are seeking to retain our current scope of practice. So let me be very clear on that.
Okay, thank you.
For the record, Madam President, I want to support you on that. We are not expanding. We are just maintaining.
Exactly. Hi, if you'd like to introduce yourself, or you can remain anonymous.
Yes, I'm Mike Madison. I'm a respiratory care practitioner in California, and I have the privilege of serving as president for the California Society for Respiratory Care. I do appreciate your comments and your broad years of experience. I do think that the respiratory care profession and the respiratory care duties are being overgeneralized. Our practitioners go through rigid training for a period of 2 years, over 72 hours of associate degree level credits, 30 hours of continuing education credits. We are credentialed by the National Board for Respiratory Care, which provides a very rigid exam and clinical simulation with branching logic and complex problem-solving issues. Mechanical ventilation is probably one of the most dangerous things that the medical profession does to patients to keep them alive. And it is our firm belief that when it comes to life support, it needs to be the most highly trained people on a regular basis dealing with these types of patients. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. I think your microphone is on. If you'd like to introduce yourself, you can.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Williams, and I first want to start out and say that I've been an RN for 43 years, and I kind of remember when the respiratory profession started. Prior to that, nurses did a lot, okay? The only concern that I have when you're starting to look at what's going to happen with the abilities of licensed vocational nurses to do respiratory assessments, we need to think about the hundreds of thousands of patients that we have in long-term care. Who is providing the respiratory assessments today? It is the majority of the staff, the licensed staff, are vocational nurses. And so we have to think about them. If we start changing the practice and we say, hey, you can't do this anymore, who is going to do the assessments for these people? There's a vast majority, and you know what? It concerns me because I'm heading there too. And I don't want to be in a nursing home waiting for someone to come from another profession to do an assessment. Because that's what I see happening. I see pieces eroding and the safety of the patients at the end of the day. Now, I firmly agree with what the respiratory board is saying as far as, ventilators and what have you. It's specialized. Not everybody should be fiddling with a ventilator. I totally agree with them. But I think that we need to look at the other pieces when we're looking at the respiratory assessment. What are we going to allow to erode? And we really shouldn't allow any of it to erode. Not one iota of anything. Because it's important.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for listening to my public comment. Ray Hernandez, Dean of Science and Math Technology over at Skyline College here in the Northern California area.
You just put a little closer to the microphone.
Ray Hernandez, Dean of Science and Math Technology over at Skyline College, Community College. And I've been a practitioner now, respiratory care practitioner now for 30 years. And of those 30 years, I've been an educator for now 23 of those. And in those years, I've been both doing practice and education. And I really appreciate certainly the conversation that has taken place in trying to understand as our healthcare environment has become more complex, and with the procedures and the information and that application of information that we learned that it has become more complex. And so I'm bringing you a lens from the educational standpoint in terms of what students need to know and do to be successful and to provide effective, safe care. And as I look at this scope of Vocational Nursing Practice Act in 2518.5, it does talk about the elements of those. And in Part A, and I appreciate, John, in your conversation, talking about the assessment piece and really focusing on that data collection piece. And when we look at the number of clock hours that entry-level practitioners come in with, healthcare providers, and then those that go on to an advanced stage, it takes a lot of time to be able to take what is direct care in basic nursing functions, and I look at Part B of the scope of practice and says perform basic nursing services. It's very important that as you take the next step, and I applaud you to do that, to really look at what the scope of practice is from a basic aspect to an advanced aspect. And particularly in those high-risk, vulnerable patients who in that healthcare provision, when you're providing that, are at high risk and could suffer from the person at the bedside not having the expertise to really look at that data and assess it and be able to act. That's a patient safety issue. So my comment here is really, as you go to that next step, really look at that basic to advanced level, and where does the scope of practice for LVNs and then where does that next practitioner begin? So thank you, appreciate it.
Good afternoon.
And thank you for the opportunity to address this issue with the board. My name is Lolita Gibson. I'm the Dean of Nursing at Carrington College. I think it is imperative that Practice Act remain the same in regards to respiratory assessment and respiratory care. We train our nurses to, although LVN nurses are thought to be task-oriented, this is a task that they can establish and report any abnormalities appropriately. And that's what we train them to do. It's not that we're not trying to replace respiratory therapy or anything like that. Of course, it takes extensive training, and we respect respiratory therapists, and I think that they should respect the Practice Act of Vocational Nursing at the utmost. It's imperative, and just like one of the previous speakers said, if you go to the skilled nursing facilities or the subacute or post-acute, our patients are sicker now. They require more attention, and usually in these situations, there's only one respiratory therapist in the whole building per shift. And so there needs to be extra sets of eyes. They can always see if something is wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to mess with the ventilator or anything like that. But to do a respiratory assessment, that is a basic nursing function. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. You would like to introduce yourself, or you can
Yes,
remain
I'm
anonymous?
Dr. Abdel Youssef. I'm the Vice President of Nursing for Unitec College. I want to say that we, as healthcare provider, all focus on the client. The client is the center of care, and that's why we are there at the hospital. And when we look at the client and the care, we see the patient from a holistic approach. So to do assessment, and a nurse, an RN, or a VN, an LVN cannot do cardiac assessment and do, renal and other system and skip the respiratory, because it doesn't make sense to anybody. Because for me as a nurse, and I'm an RN since 1992, there's no way for me to be able to formalize any care plan or participate as an LVN, participate in data collection for formalizing care plan without doing all the assessment for all the systems. So, and that's the main thing, is as a nurse, we have to be able to assess, and the systems are very, as you all know, it's very hard to say you will do only cardiac and renal, but you're not supposed to do respiratory, while you know everything is, affecting the whole thing, as a basic human, body. So that's my main concern. The whole thing is about the patient, and that's why we're all there for the patient care. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I saw a couple more people coming forward. Good afternoon. I think your microphone is already on.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Carol Mountain. I'm representing Sacramento City College. I'm also part of the practice board. And I would like to say that LVNs function in a variety of settings. And to start decreasing their scope of practice, I immediately think of the LVNs that accompany students in schools who possibly are on ventilators. And those LVNs not only need to be able to do a respiratory assessment, but they need to be able to provide care to those children so that they are able to continue to have experiences that all children need, the opportunity to go to school. And they're only able to do that being accompanied by a nurse who is 99% of the time an LVN. And to decrease that scope of practice, we would deny those children a basic right and an incredible opportunity. So we need to tread lightly as we look at these things and recognize the value that the LVN brings and the fact that nursing in general is the person who stays with the patient 24/7 and is available and needs to be able to perform the duties that provide appropriate care. And that to me is an issue of patient safety. Thank you.
I agree with you. Hello, welcome.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. My name is Sonia Shepard. I'm the Dean of Nursing at Brightwood College here in Sacramento. And I wanted to go along with what Mr. John had said and substantiate the educational aspect that our vocational nursing students are receiving. It is not just the exception for those who are in high-level care, but it is part of our practice to educate our nurses. We have a 4-term program, and they're educated with respiratory care and assessment and skills for 3 of those 4 terms. And in the 4th term, they're actually working in a TBI center where they're doing respiratory care, trach care, advanced care for those patients. These centers are also hiring RVN. So it's not only the educational level that they're receiving, it's also the work opportunity that they're receiving appropriately because of the education they've been given. I do have documentation to support the educational opportunities that we have and the training that we give our nursing students if you and the members are in favor of that.
Sure. Okay. Do you have enough for
Yes.
board members? Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Hi, good afternoon.
Monique Stefani. I'm the clinical educator at Chalk Children's Hospital in Southern California.
Please talk directly into the mic.
My name is Monique Stefani. I'm the clinical educator at Chalk Children's Hospital in Southern California, as well as the Government Affairs Committee Chair for the CSRC, as well as faculty for a community college and 2 universities. In my practice of over 15 years, I'd like to point out that, as stated earlier, it seems that our practice is being generalized when you are referring to respiratory care. We understand that respiratory assessment is part of a nursing role. We understand that it's both inclusive in the RN and the LVN role. What we do need to delineate and clarify is what is considered the fine line that needs to not be crossed over from respiratory care to registered nursing or LVN, for LVNs. Respiratory care encompasses a wide scope of practice. In that scope of practice, as we've stated already, that practice crosses over many other positions, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary roles. When we talk about respiratory care, we're forgetting if you simply generalize respiratory care, we are talking about ECLS, ECMO, we are talking about intubation, we are talking about starting A-lines, stuff that is not within the scope of practice of many other roles. So respiratory care needs to be defined within the LVN board's practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. You'd like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Estrada, and I represent the Southern California directors of vocational nursing programs. And I want to make a brief statement saying that we do support keeping the respiratory assessment and practice in the vocational nursing area. And I find that it's better to look at this as holistic. We're not just treating respiratory, because when we're treating respiratory, we're also treating cardiac, we're also treating the brain because of the oxygen, so on. So to segregate that area of practice doesn't make sense to me, and it's not part of the holistic nursing practice. So I just wanted to make that statement, and I support you, John, what you.
Tell me the name of your organization again.
Southern California Directors of Vocational Nursing Programs represents 77 directors.
Thank you. I think I've misstated that in the past, so I wanted to get that straight. More? Yes. Good afternoon, sir. If you'd like to speak directly into the microphone, you can introduce yourself or remain anonymous.
Hi, I'm Mark Goldstein. I'm a member of the Respiratory Care Board, but I've also been a practitioner since 1972. And the last 15 years, I have been in the home care arena, where the organization I work for, which is Sutter Care at Home, provides ventilators. In many cases, we provide education to different nursing organizations that do place LVNs in the home. And I really appreciate having you folks in the home, because the way things are structured, you do become the eyes and ears. The training, the ventilators, both invasive and non-invasive, and we're ending up with a lot more non-invasive ventilators going out, are very evolved. I mean, there's algorithms, there's how do you adjust the flow, the IE ratio, all this sort of stuff that really takes a lot of training. The training we provide is approximately 2 hours on how to troubleshoot the circuit of a ventilator, recognize when a ventilator is malfunctioning, and being able to put hook the patient up to the second ventilator, because we make sure all our patients have
And
2
you're
vents.
providing this training to VNs?
Beg your pardon?
You're providing this training to LVNs?
Yes, we have various nursing agencies. I think there's 7 of them locally that we do provide on occasion when we're asked the different models. So what I'm trying to say is that as a patient, in regards to patient safety, you guys are essential, but so are we in being able to actually get the patient interface and be there as a resource. But the actual training as to the operation of the machine is extremely limited. I mean, it's basically a troubleshooting function, and the picking up the phone and calling us or calling the physician. So thank you for your help that you do provide to the patients. Unfortunately, the way the financial system is within this country, respiratory therapists can't be really too much at the bedside at home. But so we do depend on your eyes and ears, and I look forward to this issue getting further defined and more definitive, so we can move on to taking care of the patient. Thank you.
I thank you for your comments. I thank you for your comments, and I agree with you that all our disciplines, you need to work together, that there's room for both disciplines to work together. I appreciate the fact that you do training, extra training with LVNs, and that you seem to have some acknowledgement of their skill level or training. I I agree that we need to work together, and that we can both maintain. There can be a win-win. Both disciplines can maintain their full scope of practice and work together, as we would never seek to encroach, or not encroach, but erode any of your RT scope of practice. I just think that this board is asking for the same consideration to respect our scope of practice. So I thank you for your comments, and they were sounded very optimistic to me. So thank you. Mr. Vertito.
Thank you, Madam President, and to the speakers. I would like to point out many of the presentations by the members of the respiratory care community are accurate. They do things that are not in the nursing VN scope of practice. Intubations are not in the nursing where they're putting it into tracheal tube, starting an arterial line, getting arterial blood gases. And I can tell that with 30 years of nursing experience, when I responded to a code, a respiratory tech is right there to save the patient's life right along with me. It is a healthcare team. And I want, as much as we're doing things to protect our scope of practice, I do not want to encroach on the respiratory care. They are viable and valuable